Remember kids, if you lack a crucifix, aggressively T-pose to ward off vampires. Ha! This is gonna be one of those games, isn't it? What is striking about the game Vampyr, developed by DONTNOD Entertainment and released in 2017, is the struggle that permeates every level of it. You might be inclined to think I'm talking about the core theme of a freshly turned vampire doctor trying to balance his oath versus his hunger, but that's not the entire picture. It tries to create a gothic atmosphere defined by the clash between morality and convenience, but the interactions used to deliver this experience are supported by a slew of industry standard systems that were not intended to complement the thematic nuances that Vampyr is aiming for. If you chase two rabbits, you will lose them both, or so the proverb goes, but that doesn't mean a chase ending in failure couldn't have been exciting while it lasted. Before we go on, I want to make a small clarification. DONTNOD Entertainment has two distinct entities under its umbrella. On the one hand, you have the adventure game franchise, Life is Strange, and on the other you have the brawler, Remember Me, and the RPG, Vampyr. While there might be overlap on the lower levels, it is clear that the high-level positions create two distinct sides at DONTNOD. For the purpose of this video, when I refer to the developer, I am referring to those who made Remember Me and Vampyr, excluding the Life is Strange devs. I believe this is a fair separation. With that out of the way, let's continue.
Slowly, vampire! Who are you?
The first hour of the game showcases both its admirable potential and its emblematic problems. A 2D animated video introduces us to the setting of 1918 London, with the First World War drawing to a close and an influenza epidemic decimating the city. Jonathan Reed, the protagonist, awakens in a mass grave, unaware of his vampiric condition. The music is foreboding while the diegetic audio is heavily reduced, not to mention the black and white filter. This is a pretty bad day, or rather night, for our hero. Consumed by bloodlust, Jonathan attacks the first person he sees, which just so happens to be the sister that was looking for him, and unfortunately his first kill.
My sweet brother, what have you done?
Mary! Oh, no! Mary!
To make matters worse, vampire hunters immediately descend, guns a-blazing. Now, while murdering his sister under frenzy was a dramatic moment where focus and context is given, the vampire hunters, not so much. A strategically placed machete leads into the combat tutorial where an agitated but otherwise completely lucid Jonathan brutally murders a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people. But don't worry, because...
Sorry!
See, he apologized, so it's fine. Very British. This sequence ends with being forced to find sanctuary in a plague-ridden home because the adverse effects of the rising sun are starting to manifest. Now, suddenly, things are quiet again. You get to explore the environment, learn about the former occupants of the house or Jonathan's past. And this is where most players will probably notice something.
That's the enemy coming! The orders are to evacuate the hospital!
Done. He'll live.
And now what?
We fight. Killing is a hell of a lot easier than healing. No, it never got easy.
The writing can actually be good. It is by no means uniformly good, but the main character is compelling. Eventually though, the weight of his actions sinks in and Jonathan tries to commit suicide. After the title intro, the tutorial actually continues with Jonathan exploring the limits of his new powers and finding a body drained of blood. While at first he believes this might be his maker's victim, it is actually a lesser beast. He does encounter a doctor though, Edgar Swansea, that investigates the supernatural, and Lady Ashbury, a true vampire. Thus we are led into the game proper, with Jonathan taking a position as a night shift doctor, the plan being to work on combating the epidemic while figuring out how to deal with his new condition. As far as beginnings go, it is above average in many regards, but the back and forth struggle between the positives and negatives is glaring. Is the player in for a run-of-the-mill action RPG or a socially oriented exploration of vampirism? What's more, this also ties into the thematic expectations. The intro effectively creates tension, but for what kind of story? One about plague and slaughter, or dealing with family and feelings in the face of becoming a monster, or perhaps using the scientific method to combat the supernatural? These are valid expectations to have based on this introduction, but they can't all have the limelight. Meaning some people will believe that the game lied to them when what they took from the intro doesn't pan out to be what the game is about. This is a good example of why you shouldn't create tension without also setting the tone of your story. You are inviting your audience to have false expectations. That being said, I do want to praise the developer for having an excellent premise from a narrative design perspective. When making a protagonist with a past in an RPG, it is always a balancing act when it comes to player knowledge versus avatar knowledge. Explain too little and it feels detached, explain too much and it feels incredulous. This is why amnesia is so overused. It is a blunt force narrative device that equalizes knowledge between the two parties. Vampyr, on the other hand, knocks it out of the park. It does this by having a fresh vampire protagonist in their own hometown.
Clarence Crossley, how are you? My God, so you survived the war too. So sorry I didn't recognize you at first.
Jonathan knows a lot about the world and people recognize him, but the player gets to find out about the supernatural world alongside him. It is a great mix of having a lot of new information to uncover about the world while also grounding the avatar in said world. Hats off to DONTNOD. Now, before going into details of Jonathan's newly given unlife, I'm going to address what is probably the elephant in the room for some people that have watched up to this point. The game is technically unimpressive. Something that most players will quickly realize due to some rather hectic frame rate drops that don't seem to be affected by the graphical settings all that much. There is a fine line between tech issues that distract from the experience and tech issues that detract from the experience. Vampyr falls into the latter far too often, with moments such as these. Having my character randomly teleport during swing animations is not okay. It is very hard to draw a line in the sand and say this is where the critical mass of bugs overshadows the rest of the game, but Vampyr is playing with fire. For example, use of the controller is advisable since mouse targeting is done by moving left or right, and this has a tendency to be unreliable. Those seemingly random target switches were not intentional. The game never gets unplayable, but like I said, playing with fire. Beyond the optimization and such, Vampyr is also really ugly sometimes, and it can be so in some very distracting ways. Old games are technologically dated, but visual coherence can keep them looking pleasant forever. In contrast, look at this man. The face is on the lower end of quality by 2017 standards, but the beard is a single textured object, something that games used to do 15 years ago. There is also this shockingly common streaming issue where characters don't get their high poly versions when you approach them. They look absolutely terrible because you were never meant to see them like this. Such issues are incredibly disappointing because the people responsible for the environments are worth their weight in gold. Very rarely have I ever toggled walk in a game and just soaked in the atmosphere. A lot of love was put into making this start of the century version of London. I can't tell you how historically accurate it is not an area of expertise I have, but I can say that it feels how it should pop culture wise. I will quibble with the lighting though, it is far too bright. Games very rarely do realistic nighttime because the obscured vision might get in the way of gameplay, but Vampyr doesn't even approach this danger. The clarity and view distance with which you can see the environments is more reminiscent of a very cloudy day rather than nighttime. An argument can be made that this site is a vampire trait, which would have been very clever if the devs acknowledged this. Even if this was the case though, it would in no way be a good trait to severely dampen the aesthetics for a minor bit of world building. The sound suffers from all the same type of problems as the visuals. Non-creative issues where the musicians and artists made content for the game, but it just wasn't implemented well. In the case of the music, it is great, with a very talented cellist doing amazing work and with the occasional flares of industrial electronic music. Moments like the one I showed before or this one are excellent. but they are in no way representative of the general experience, which is more like this. Far too often, Vampyr has a completely dead soundscape. It feels insulting to the musician that made this soundtrack that I had to discover it after playing the game and listening to the tracks one by one. Tech issues always hinder creative vision, but I find it hard to believe that the developers couldn't have used the soundtrack more effectively. With all that being said, I am judging Dontnod this harshly by the measure of a large professional studio. This is still a game that cost millions of dollars and needed tens of people working on it for several years. The technical aspect is subpar by arguably the highest standard in the industry. But this game wasn't made to showcase new technologies or visually dazzle people. The core of Vampyr's premise is the gameplay systems that facilitate the balance between being a bloodthirsty monster and being bound by the Hippocratic Oath. The game takes place across an overworld composed of 4 districts and various instanced abandoned locations, such as plague houses or the sewers. As a doctor, Jonathan must visit each of these places, finding out what ails people and providing medicine, but that only scratches the surface. The interactions with the game's people are governed by the citizen system, which is arguably the centerpiece of Vampyr's identity. Each person is fully represented via a name and various clues that are attached to them and can be unlocked by talking, stalking, or exploring the environment. These clues represent private information that varies from generic backstories to darker things such as the desire to commit murder. All of this gets quantified into a district health meter. The healthier the district, the better the prices Jonathan gets at merchants, but on the flip side, if the meter reaches critical health, then the plague takes over, causing monsters to appear and citizens to disappear. Why would Jonathan allow this to happen? Because he is a vampire and thus he can turn patients into victims to slake his bloodthirst. Gameplay-wise, embracing victims gives experience, which feeds in a traditional level system. The higher the level, the easier the time you'll have in combat, but embracing isn't the only way to gain experience. Just by far the most efficient, and thus this is the dilemma around which Vampyr is built around. Struggle but keep your hands clean, or indulge in darker instincts to breeze through fights. It is clear that this system was built on the concept of exploring morality in a way that is different to how most games do it, which is commendable and it does feel special. Talking to people, giving them medicine, finding about their vice and virtues, pondering if they deserve to be bitten by Jonathan, it is a compelling premise for a gothic adventure. There is also a design decision related to this system that I want to commend, which is tying the experience killing gives to the amount of clues known and the health status of the victim. It is a very smart way to disincentivize the player from taking the mass murdering approach where they kill everyone as soon as possible. Instead, it guides the player towards the socially savvy predator aspect of the vampire myth. Even if Jonathan is played in the most murderous way possible, the optimal path is to first uncover all the clues associated with the chosen victim, and to complete any of their quests, which are called investigations in this game. This creates the opportunity for empathy, since you might find out that the victim has dependents that will starve without them, thus arguably making the choice harder.
Most people don't become thugs when unemployed. This is a choice you made.
I don't care what you think, sir. I do what I have to do for my own reasons, and that's that.
But you are not responsible for your father's actions.
Am I not? Dad always says that he joined that gang for my safety. So if I wasn't born, people wouldn't be worrying about Colossus Joe.
What's more, there is a mesmerizing statistic that is increased at fixed points in the narrative, and Jonathan can only feed on citizens that have equal or lower willpower than the mesmerizing level. While arguably contrived, this measure was necessary to stop the player from having the option to totally trivialize the content by over-leveling. Taking all of this together, it is clear a lot of thought went into how the player will be able to go about the game's morality premise. But what about the other part of said premise, the actual fighting that Jonathan is meant to struggle with if he has a clear conscience? Well, the more perceptive among you might have already asked themselves. Combat sections were shown in the video before talking about the social system. What about the people killed there? How do they fit into all of this? They don't.
He told me that you have not taken another life since your poor sister died.
Whenever you exit one of the social areas, you smash cut into an alternate universe where you are playing a very different game, yet a familiar one as well. Your actions cost stamina, your supernatural abilities cost blood, and attack animations slide you towards the target a la Arkham Asylum. You have crafting, you can carry a big weapon in 2 hands or 2 smaller weapons in each, etc. The action part of this action RPG is very much by the numbers. There are nuances here and there, but overall it doesn't distinguish itself in any particular aspect. As for the enemies, they are located on the roads and in the sewers between districts, and are vampire hunters called the Guards of Premen on one side and various vampiric monsters on the other. They don't get along. Any death here is completely separated from the judgment of the social system. This is weird to say the least. Giselle is an embittered, destitute woman, worn down by life. A righteous labor activist, she is resentful of Jonathan and his upper-class upbringing, but that's not all. Dig deeper and you find her bitterness is accentuated by the strained relationship with her sister, which was caused by their mother's death due to a terrible, drawn-out illness. Such is life at the dock in these times. Oh, and she's also a level 24 vampire hunter with a resistance to range attacks who can survive getting impaled by shadow tentacles and can take Jonathan one-on-one. It is very hard, actually impossible, to reconcile the twin existence of this person within the game's systems and at the same time keep a coherent experience. This is Ludo-Ludo Dissonance. These UI elements hold fundamentally different interpretations of what a human is. In one, they are respawning mobs that exist so the player can inflict cathartic violence upon them, and in the other they are people with names, jobs, friends, vice, virtues, and all that is in between. You can draw direct parallels between the two states of the game in terms of how they approach different features, such as biting, which instantly kills someone in a social setting but deals just a small amount of damage in combat, or how draining only gives massive experience in the social setting. Vampire hunters don't count. Not only are the two main systems of the game incompatible, they are also in direct opposition to each other. This is the core issue that plagues Vampyr and the most emblematic struggle within it, from which many of the smaller struggles emanate. The game contextualizes Jonathan Ree's journey as either someone who keeps their humanity in the face of adversity, or as someone who trades parts of their humanity to overcome adversity to various degrees, possibly down to the point where there is nothing left. This is not a game that needed trash mobs, and yet here they are. This dissonance between the social aspect and the combat is not something that is in any way subtle. The developers were evidently aware of it, and players became aware of it very soon into the game. So why? Why is Vampyr's attempt at something novel marred by the badly connected generic elements? The answer is Knights of the Old Republic. Knights of the Old Republic, KOTOR for short, was an RPG developed by BioWare and released in 2003 for the PC and Xbox. Though not generally considered as an action RPG, it was a very clear departure from the traditional computer RPGs that BioWare had previously developed, such as Baldur's Gate. If you compare them both to a pure action game like 2002's Enclave that also released on the Xbox, it is obvious which game provides an experience closer to Enclave's. While both Baldur's Gate and KOTOR were based on pen and paper games, it is clear that they had very different focuses. This can be seen in what people remember those games for. Baldur's Gate is all about build diversity and excellent encounter design, while KOTOR is all about the characters and narrative moments, especially the big twist of that story. The reason why it is so important to discuss KOTOR for the purpose of understanding Vampyr is because it was a smash hit and is recognized as one of the games that made the Xbox a strong brand. It was so much of a success that it became one of the two templates that Western RPGs, especially those on console, follow for the next decade, with the other half being the Elder Scrolls. Games such as Mass Effect, Witcher 2, Alpha Protocol, Demonomicon, the Technomancer, etc. have obvious differences, but they have enough of the template inside of them that they occupy the same family tree, so to speak. Flat level design, scripted environmental interactions, reactivity always being made via dialogue, low build diversity, shallow crafting, binary morality systems, and so on and so forth. Vampyr joins that family tree, but it wants to be a different type of fruit at the same time, to continue the metaphor. KOTOR's gameplay was built to be as flavorless as possible since it was a game centered on exploiting a license. The Star Wars aesthetic was at the front and center, not necessarily the type of interactions available in the game. It is plainly obvious to see this with Jade Empire, BioWare's next game after KOTOR, which was almost the same thing systems-wise, but with a Chinese fantasy coat of paint. And that's exactly the issue. Vampyr cannot be just an average action adventure to relay the type of premise it wants. It needs a higher level of narrative and gameplay fusion that goes beyond the template KOTOR set. One of the best examples of how generic systems aren't able to handle the themes is leveling. If you watch footage of the combat, you might think the action is dominant, but that is not so. The statistics play a much more important role than you might think. This isn't by mistake, in fact it is one of the main selling points. Vampyr wants you to struggle in combat, so you are tempted to start draining people for all the experience points they are worth. That is why statistics are so emphasized. If you are equal in level to a creature, then the fight is easy. 5 levels over and you are struggling. 10 levels over and you are probably going to get one shot. Problem is, this dynamic is fundamentally flawed from the get-go. You are given an infinite amount of tries to overcome a combat situation. Dying just resets you to the last save. There isn't anything at stake when losing except your time and the testing of your determination. How do you keep a good pacing for the binary morality of powering up via murder or persevering through adversity when a player might try 100 times while another might give up after the first? To make matters worse, there is the third option: grinding. Enemies respawn after you die or sleep, and you can decide to be a good boy by just murdering nameless mobs over and over again to gain a few levels instead of eating civilians. The concept of respawning enemies goes against the very idea of making every person you encounter a life or death decision, but it is such a commonly used feature that it either wasn't questioned or nobody wanted to question it. It speaks to a lack of creative fortitude and will to merge the social and combat system together. This is even more visible with the difficulty settings. They were not present at launch, they were added later on, and the story mode blatantly says that this is an inferior way to play the game. They weren't able to make one finely tuned and engaging difficulty mode. Why add another as well as one that is admittedly a bad idea? Same as the other thing that they added post-launch: respec. The game enforces a single save slot to emphasize choice and no backtracking, but then they decided that combat should not suffer from these constraints, adding even more separation between the game's parts. Additional difficulty modes and the ability to respec your skills aren't intrinsically bad features, but they aren't instantly good in whatever you put them in. But here's the thing, even if all those details were better designed and executed, it would still only paper over the main issue, which is how the leveling system interacts with the premise. The way the game is, it presents getting as many levels as possible so you can breeze through combat as a desirable goal, the temptation that the player must confront. Within the universe of interactions and gameplay language that Vampyr has created, its designers communicate to the player that bad combat systems are ones in which you struggle and must learn, while in the good ones you just march forward, winning through minimal struggle because you have the bigger number. Alternatively, it can be said that the execution failed, but the intention was for the under-leveled state to be the preferable one. But if that is the case, then what is the point of the choice presented by the game? Stay under-leveled to experience engaging gameplay and be praised by the game, or be over-leveled to experience trivial gameplay and be chastised by the game? This isn't a choice, or at least not an interesting one. And to add the last nail in the coffin, I have to mention the technical issues again. When this happens, the morality of the game breaks. When cheated by the simulation, embracing people is no longer the exploration of Jonathan Reed taking the easy route in the face of adversity. It turns into an arms race between the player and the developer. These aren't people, they are experience boosts that can be used to fight against a badly made game. All of this can only lead me to say one thing: the attempt of having the struggle between Jonathan's humanity and his vampirism be mediated through a social system and combat system that will link together is a failure. It didn't go far enough to have its own identity, and instead it is the odd one out in a family of games that have bland gameplay with a focus on context and aesthetics. But let's look at things from the other side as well now. Many games took the generic action RPG formula, but Vampyr actually tried to do something more with it. Isn't that worthy of praise? Well, for that praise to be awarded solely to the social system would need to be excellent in isolation, and while it may appear to be so at first, the illusion only lasts for a few hours. Once you get familiar with the nuts and bolts, it is plain to see that even in isolation, Vampyr's attempt at community is broken in more ways than one. By far the most visible issue is the degrees of separation. The whole point of districts is to simulate a sense of community, that one's life is inextricably entangled with others and their death or well-being has a knock-on effect. But here's the problem: the three elements of this system, the people, their clues, and their investigations, are almost completely separated from each other. Citizens can be in a social circle that is made of 3 people at the most, and outside of those people, they have no other effect upon the world, except the district health meter. Each social circle within a district is basically a small vignette. To give an example, there is a priest that preaches in the street about the plague and how it is divine punishment.
Tell me, Tobias, what exactly is your plan concerning the cleansing of this city?
God will recognize his own. More than once this city has risen from the ashes, hardened and purified by the flames.
Not a single other character mentions him in their dialogue. If you take the scripts of each non-main quest character and extract all the names they pronounce, it becomes clear how disconnected their script feels in regard to the district in which they live. That destroys the sense of community this system was supposed to foster. But it gets even worse when it comes to investigations due to the bizarre limitation of not exhausting dialogue options. The game uses a generic wheel system where you have a maximum of 4 options on the screen at any time. The devs did the sensible thing by creating layers where one option leads to others. Not a bad idea, but lacking in scalability. That's why Vampyr only goes 3 layers deep at the most. Any more and keeping track of where you are in the conversation starts impacting the user experience. But combine this with the inability to remove dialogue options and we quickly run out of space to accommodate complex quest structures. This is mathematically plain to see. You have areas of discussion, then a particular subject, and then between 1 to 4 options on said subject. But keep in mind that the bottom options in the first layer are delegated to the exit button and a context-sensitive main quest dialogue line, which leaves us with 2 options for everything else. 2 plus 8 plus 32 equals 42. That maximum of 42 dialogue options, of which the branching points must cover clue explanations, clue giving, quest details, and flavor dialogue, is not a lot. That is not a technical issue. After all, the main quest dialogue line changes based on your progress, but rather a side effect of the disconnected nature of the game's content. From the moment the tutorial is finished to the moment when the epilogue starts, every single clue must be discoverable once a character has been met. Thus, we can see the chain of logic that led to this problem. The side content is separated, so it must be doable at any point, so the game world cannot change states, so multi-stage quests cannot be created, so we have a shallow system. It creates an incredible feel of artificiality, and more so, it feels artificial in ways that blunt the positive aspects. The game has reactivity. If you kill someone, their social circle will notice, but it is so predictable that it won't affect anything else, which takes away from the surprise that reactivity is supposed to create. Go to a new district, talk to everyone once or twice, do the few quests that there are, and then ignore them. The game won't bring up these people in any way, shape, or form ever again. Furthermore, the artificiality spills over in the main quest as well. Within every district, there is a person who is the pillar of the community. They have a role in the main quest, and if they get removed, the district loses a huge chunk of health. But they are subject to the same constraints as the side content, meaning they have one quest associated with them, and after that you can pretty much ignore them, with the exception of Dr. Swansea, your sidekick of sorts who you visit often. To solve this issue, the main quest is mostly filled with NPCs that are outside the citizen menu, which undermines the whole purpose of having a somewhat simulationist social system. It is immensely disingenuous to say that you can choose to kill everybody or nobody in Vampyr, when most of the main quest characters and those you meet in combat are not part of that choice. Vampyr's social system has to be one of the best examples of the phrase, wide as an ocean, deep as a puddle. And it is important to note this system doesn't just feel incomplete, leaving you wanting more, but rather it feels incomplete in that jagged edge sort of way. Something most visible in terms of resolutions, it actively harms the player's engagement due to the lack of solutions. You can kill or ignore people. In the hospital area, there are 2 doctors that want to recommend a treatment for a specific patient.
Tell me about the doctors who are arguing about your case.
Strickland and Aykroyd. They both want the best for me, but there's a lot of pride there. Doctors are no different from carpenters, it seems.
One treatment is experimental and the other standard. This dilemma doesn't advance when you complete the doctor's shared investigations, find their clues, or exhaust all their dialogue options. No, it only advances if you kill one of them, so the other is free to administer their treatment. The kill/ignore options are the hammer to the nail that is the citizens' problems. Vampyr only changes game states via murder, which feels incredibly constraining. It presents having zero empathy via ignorance as a virtue, which breaks the game's central theme of being a doctor or a monster. The best example of how badly this all works out is the Rat Lady. In the West End, you encounter a crazed woman that maniacally feeds on rat guts. After finding out all of her clues, it becomes apparent she is compelled by a vampire to do this. There is no option to help her. You cannot find the vampire, override his control, take the woman to the hospital, or any number of helpful choices. Instead, you can either ignore her or kill her, either because you wish to grant her request for death or you just want to feed. And what is worse is that the game judges you, without giving spoilers, for every person you feed on. So from the game's perspective, the morally correct choice here is just to utterly ignore this woman's suffering. This bit of side content fits with the game's atmosphere and tone like an elephant through a straw. Vampyr simply isn't equipped with the necessary level of interaction to present this woman's problem in a way that seems plausible. This entire premise simply should not exist within the context that the gameplay framework creates. Here's the thing though, everything I have mentioned up to this point is fixable, with lots of work and iterations of course, but the base idea of how citizens exist within this world is solid. Or is it? This didn't occur to me except after I finished the game and started writing the script, but I slowly came to realize that Vampyr's social system is rotten to the core. It lacks the ability to assign weight. What do I mean by this? Let's take health bars as an example. This is a basic design tool where enemies are assigned a visual which indicates the numerical value representing how difficult it is to kill them. While simple and almost universal, some developers have managed to use it in clever ways to assign weight and thus create tension. Games such as Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, and don't worry, I'm not going to spoil anything. Just know that bosses in that game have HP bars along with an associated percentile that starts at 100. But the last boss has 2 HP bars layered on top of each other with a 200% associated percentile, thus immediately telling the player that this encounter is a big deal. It is an effective use of game design to communicate with the player non-verbally. Vampyr's citizen menu simply isn't capable of such subtleties. It cannot scale based on the game's needs. This is best evidenced by the fact that 2 of the people in West End are the protagonist's mother and family butler. Important people with important dialogue, but they are still trapped within the separation between people, clues, investigation. The game designers couldn't use the tools they had available to communicate to the player that, from an interaction perspective, these people are different from a random street thug. They couldn't tie them into elaborate quest chains with grand effects upon the world and upon Jonathan. The funny thing is that you can see how they tried. The investigation associated with them involves finding a bunch of hidden letters scattered around the world, and no other quest uses this template. Either consciously or subconsciously, the designer working on this bit of the game realized that the protagonist's family should have bespoke content and interactions. There just wasn't all that much that they could do. This system's intended experience should be something akin to Twin Peaks, where you delve into the web of secrets that ties a community together, but instead it feels like you're a state worker going about doing the census. Find person, learn all there is about them, then kill or move on. Repeat about 3 dozen times. There is a platonic ideal of this game where all the elements shown in the citizens menu are intertwined to create a sense of place that would make 1918 London's one of the best video game worlds ever attempted. Sadly, this is not the case, and what we are left with is not unplayable and not incapable of generating quality moments, but certainly a shadow of what could have been, which is just disappointing. Iteration upon this system probably requires going back to the drawing board in regard to many of its aspects. Now, on the flip side of the social system is the combat, and one could make the argument that a good combat system can carry a game, even in isolation, because cathartic violence is something games can do very well. I have something to confess though. I have spent hours rewriting this bit of the script that focuses on combat, and I have never found it to be satisfactory, because it is so bog standard and thus boring to talk about. It felt like I was going down the list of features and saying, not good but not really bad, just really boring. The level design is flat, enemies have annoying interrupts, crafting is unexciting but reliable, there are no non-combat abilities, etc. Rather than doing that for 10 minutes, I'm just going to jump to the conclusion, which is that combat is mediocre both in terms of action gameplay and animations plus sound effects. What's more, if you look at what Vampyr sets out to achieve and how it fails at that, improving the action part of the combat system is probably the least important part. Vampyr: The Masquerade Bloodlines has notoriously bad combat, but people love it for a slew of other reasons. Something that admittedly Vampyr could have achieved as well. After all, the KOTOR template has always been about context. Its gameplay was meant to be flavorless, so you can easily build around any setting you want. Does the context of Vampyr justify its own existence at the risk of having other weaker aspects? Well, it is worthy of praise that this is a consistent gothic story through and through. The start in the communal grave didn't lie about what sort of game this would be. Serial killers, child abuse, murderous spouses, those are the sort of things that make the fabric of this game's tone. London is on the brink of collapse, social order is breaking down, entire areas are depopulated by the plague, and on top of that, vampire hunters battle with monsters throughout the night. There were moments when I thought the tone would shift too much into fantasy due to the fact that there is an ancient evil prophecy involved, but that never happened. The game also has a good sense to introduce some levity from time to time. Not every person needs to have a dark, tragic backstory or be a twisted bastard. Like this wannabe vampire hunter that asks Jonathan to spread anti-vampire posters around town.
Yes. I plan to put up posters to alert the population to the vampire threat.
Are you asking me to paste posters about vampires around the docks?
If you wouldn't mind.
I will say though that the game has an annoying habit of including wink wink nudge nudge moments. Things like turning historical figures into vampires or Lady Ashbury having a signed copy of Dracula. Your mileage may vary, but having situations like this is ridiculous.
I don't know which kind of doctor you're used to dealing with, but it's a doctor's purpose to heal people.
And is it your purpose as well, Mr. Reed? I would say it's a convenient way for gaining people's trust.
You are a night shift doctor offering medicine during times of plague. This line of dialogue was blatantly written with the player in mind when it should be written for Jonathan. Which brings me to the next thing I found commendable, Jonathan himself.
Informing London's inhabitants of the presence of vampires. What does that make me? A double or a triple agent?
The voice actor and scriptwriters did an excellent job of having him emote properly in a wide variety of situations. He can be inquisitive, outraged, heartbroken, cheeky, and so on. It would have been real easy to make him a stereotypical woe is me gothic character, but he actually feels fairly grounded. Considering the amount of time we spend with him, I would say that the character of Jonathan Reed is probably one of the game's highlights. And to give credit where it is due, good characterization is a constant in Vampyr. The writing quality, from the perspective of making character dialogue be believable and engaging, is actually above average. And what's more, these characters exist within the context of a complete story. Without spoiling anything, there is no cliffhanger ending, character arcs are closed, and it feels like a planned story from start to finish. This seems like something obvious, but we live in an age where popular media must be built from the ground up to sustain sequels. This, often, adversely affects the quality of said media, especially in the narrative department. Games tend to suffer from this doubly so. Both the live service model and the yearly release model aren't exactly friendly towards conclusive stories with strong thematic cores. Note, that doesn't mean that there cannot be another game set in the Vampyr universe. It is just that when the credits roll, you don't have to wonder if they're going to release a sequel. But a complete story is by no means a good one, or a well-structured one. Put simply, Vampyr has many moments when the dialogue options available do not make sense. The narrative flow of information is not charted out properly. This is a complicated issue because these problems are ostensibly plot holes, but there is more to it than that. The info that Jonathan has just does not sync with the state of the world. A dozen hours into the story, this happens when you talk to Lady Ashbury, the vampire that saves Jonathan during the intro.
A vampire? Is that what I am? What we are?
We are a quarter of the game in. Occult notes have been found, people have been mesmerized, and goddamn werewolves have been fought. Jonathan showing disbelief at the concept of him being a vampire is incredulous. That's just the tip of the iceberg. This happens over and over again. At one point, you fight this Hulk subspecies of vampire, and immediately after the fight, you are told what it is.
What the hell was that thing? He wasn't an Ekon or a Scout.
They are known as Volkod, an ancient offshoot of immortals.
Hours later, you encounter that vampire's masters, and this happens.
Even before becoming that magnificent beast, he was a brute. He served me well for decades.
No, I mean, what was he? He was clearly no ordinary vampire.
No, he was a Volkod. All muscles and instinct.
One more just to drive the point home. You encounter a body drained of blood during the prologue, and you find out that it is the handiwork of a ghoul that craves blood.
This creature is bedeviled.
Let go of me.
I must put it down.
Problem is that skells, or ghouls, feed on flesh, not on blood.
These skulls feed from corpses and the husks of animals. They're not after blood.
Unlike you. The feeding habits of ghouls is even a plot point later on. Either events were shuffled around at the last minute, or there wasn't someone in charge whose duty it was to keep the coherence of the story's details. That hurts the verisimilitude of the world building, and it makes it seem like the developers didn't care, although I am fairly certain this wasn't the case. By the way, I keep jumping around between the terms Skal and Ghoul, so let's clear this up. The game reeks of naming by trademark. Skals are ghouls, vampires are echons, werewolves are just beasts, etc. Now, the idea of vampire society having their own terms is fine, but the reason I think this was made for copyright purposes is the presence of things such as aggravated damage, which is lifted directly out of Vampire the Masquerade. I can see the higher-ups at DONTNOD being scared of a lawsuit, which I can understand. But the smoking gun is the title. The Y is used to represent choices in dialogue, which is cute, but outside of that Y doesn't matter. Nobody in the entire game uses the word vampire with a Y at the end. I'm not saying this is an outright bad thing, but I would be lying if I didn't say it dampens things a bit to realize the naming conventions are so blatantly done to avoid lawsuits. Kind of disappointing. Much like Jonathan's milquetoast appraisal of progressivism.
You're right. I have never suffered from poverty. But that doesn't mean I don't fight it and its consequences.
The game actually does a good job of going to both the highest and the lowest of society in London. You get to see the distant aristocracy and the chaotic rabble, both in normal and supernatural society. The Ascalon Club is made of Britain's oldest vampires who influence the Empire, but they refuse to admit Lady Ashbury because she is a woman. That immortal men would double down on their conservative opinions with age is an interesting take. Too bad we don't engage with it. See, the problem here is of implied neutrality. The modern player might have the luxury of neutrality, but Jonathan most certainly does not. He is a male straight doctor with a prestigious education, banker father, and who lives in a rather large house in the East End of London. He is what they call prime gulag material. There's nothing wrong with having a privileged bourgeois protagonist, but it becomes an issue when he confronts the social issues of the day because there's no real engagement with it. Jonathan encounters people like a woman who wishes to be a doctor, a gay couple, or a labor activist, and his stance is a few lines of dialogue where he says, "You are fighting for your rights? Well, I agree, keep doing that." Now moving on to more important things.
I admire your honesty. It takes courage to stand up to society. The world needs people like you to create change.
It feels offensively inoffensive. And to be clear, I'm not advocating for any specific stance, just that Jonathan should have some strong stances. Maybe he is dedicated to workers' rights and puts that on the table when talking to the vampire aristocracy of the Ascalon Club. Or maybe he wants to send a gay couple to the asylum because seeing homosexuality as a psychiatric disorder was common in that time period. As it stands, it is interesting to see the social issues of 1918 being paid lip service to in a video game, but that's all that happens. This surface level attention to the issues of the world is also indicative of what is, to me, the biggest issue with Vampyre's narrative. This is a bit more subjective, so let me explain. The game has two main narratives, the plague with all the defeat the ancient evil connotations it brings, and the emotional struggles of Jonathan in the vampire world. I wanted there to be a third one, the scientist versus the supernatural. Vampyr actually uses the mythology of vampires common to that era rather than the modern one in which the game was made. This means that vampire tropes that faded in contemporary times are present here. Tropes such as being stunned by symbols of faith, not being able to walk on holy ground, being damaged by living plant matter, or not being able to enter a home unless invited. This creates an excellent opportunity for the rationally minded Jonathan to try and apply the scientific method to these utterly incomprehensible vampire traits. One of my favorite moments in the game is when Jonathan has to guide an operation on a convulsing patient while also being under the effects of hunger due to all the blood emerging. It is a good scene that merges the problems of vampirism with the situations a doctor might encounter. I also appreciate the fact that this game emphasizes that this is a curse and Jonathan is not just a dark fantasy superhero. But that's about it. I wanted more. I wanted things like a pharmaceutical system where you analyzed compounds and made drugs, a bestiary where you add information on dissected monsters, a notebook where you collect all the occult knowledge and draw conclusions. Those are the type of things I would have liked to see, but the game isn't about that. The scientific aspect is a thin coat of paint that means that sometimes, besides talking to people or finding journals, you also collect samples which point you towards the next step of the quest. It is an aesthetic wrapper, not something of thematic substance.
I just need a moment. If I can learn something about what has happened to William, I'll be a step closer to understanding what happened to me.
This poor creature can't be my maker.
But like I said, this is a subjective point. Although I will note that this angle would have been far more original and thus arguably have a bigger chance to stand out. Instead, we are left with the two aforementioned standard narratives. This is where spoilers are necessary, so skip to the shown timestamp if you don't wish to see them. The story itself is a bit modular. Generally speaking, Jonathan's motivation is dealing with the plague and dealing with the state of being a vampire, which morphs into a love story with Lady Ashbury. But there are a lot of twists and turns to get there, which reminds me of another good vampire game. The story does a good job of showing the world in which it takes place. You meet a lot of factions: the Guard of Prewen, the Brotherhood of St. Paul Stowe, the Sewer Scouts, the Ascalon Club, the Romanian Diaspora, etc. The peripheral part of the narrative is really well done. The places you go to and the people you meet give a good sense of verisimilitude. It fits very well with the newborn vampire aspect. The world has interesting parts and you go to where those interesting parts are. By the way, since I mentioned Romania, I have to give props for the pronunciation.
Tell me about yourself, Dorothy.
There is not much to say. My real name is Dorothea Crasciunescu. I was born in Romania, and I may have been the best nurse Pembroke ever had.
That's not bad, although Dorothea is spelled without an H. They got it right in the in-game notes, but wrong in the localization. I admit a certain subjective bias towards seeing my nation represented in an RPG. That doesn't happen a lot, if ever. Thanks, DONTNOD. That being said, the main narrative is not great due to pacing problems. The information flow that is fed to the player often stagnates. I remember stopping at hour 25 out of a 40-hour game and going over what I knew, which was: the plague turns people into ghouls, there is some malevolent force behind it, and my maker wants me to fight it specifically. That is not a lot and it feels like there is no build-up, which is not true, but the result is that 80% of the plague plot gets introduced in the last 5 hours of the game. While obviously a flaw, there is a reason why things turned out this way. The game has to make room for the sister showdown.
So me being a vampire could have been a mistake.
I very much doubt it, Jonathan. Contrary to the legends, it is not as simple to make another vampire by just biting someone.
It can't be that hard considering a small lick was all it took. This is the game's big twist, and it is around the halfway point that it is revealed. Mary does not take to being a vampire very well. She goes kill crazy and stalks Jonathan until they fight. This was actually the game's highlight. There were stakes. It takes place in the cemetery where Mary was buried. She wields her own cross as a weapon and has a black rose motif both for her outfit and powers. There is also a vicar that can be saved or killed by either Jonathan or Mary for blood. An actual non-dialogue gameplay choice. A lot of care went into this sequence to make it feel like a strong finale, which is exactly the problem because everything else afterwards needs to be judged by it. Hell, they even have Mary commenting on your actions during the fight. Exactly the sort of thing you expect at the end of an RPG.
Spared, Sean Hampton. Don't expect the same mercy from me.
By contrast, fighting an ancient evil that wants to destroy the city is far less engaging, and I will make an assumption and say the devs would think the same thing when comparing the two fights. An evil goddess that might be the source of vampirism manifests as a plague monster periodically, and another ancient vampire chooses a champion to fight said monster. They have done this a number of times. That's the gist of the plague plot. It feels like a standard chosen one story, with the sister plot stealing its oxygen, and the science element being subdued. All I have to say is that it's a by-the-numbers video game story. Up until the epilogue. After dealing with the plague monster, Jonathan leaves London to chase after Lady Ashbury, who discovered that she was the healthy carrier of the plague. She got it from her maker, who is William Tell, the legendary historical knight and the previous chosen one to fight the goddess. A lot of interesting information is revealed in this section, but this is also where the plot crunch comes into sharp relief, because there is a lot of exposition here. Note, not mysteries that the player has been curious about, just straight up world building. This is what I mean by the fact that the sister plot stole oxygen from the plague plot. So many things being shoved at the end does not good storytelling make. They should have been sprinkled across the game to create mystery and suspense. Picture Frodo waking up in Rivendell after the Mount Doom finale and then being pulled aside by Gandalf, who tells him all about the Silmarillion. That's how it feels like to hear all this exposition. At any rate, the epilogue ends in one of 4 ways depending on how many people Jonathan embraced. Lady Ashbury wants to commit suicide because she is a healthy carrier, while Jonathan wants her to stay alive so he can develop an antidote. In the best ending, they leave together to America, and in the worst, Jonathan becomes Dracula, more or less. It is a standard morality tale, and it would have been a fine way to contextualize Jonathan's choices if not for all the issues I mentioned with the social and combat system. But the choice aspect is not limited to just the ending. There are lesser choices to make during the game's dialogue, represented by the Y symbol appearing along with always free options. This is where the game has a massive issue with the dialogue system, something that is emblematic of dialogue wheels in general, namely the disconnect between what the player thinks will be said and what will actually be said. When making a bad choice by not understanding, it breaks the trust between player and game maker. For example, this nurse is blackmailing Lady Ashbury and you have to stop it. It is one of the big choices in the game. The default options are kill or spare, but you can unlock a third option, charm. The game teaches you that blue options are good, they are special and they reveal clues. But the game turns this on you. Spare is the morally good choice. Charm results in mind-breaking the victim, which ends up turning her into a ghoul, arguably a fate worse than death. Now let me be clear, having choices reflect badly upon the player can be an effective way to say something important. But those choices need to feel earned. Vampyr struggles many times, too many times in my opinion, when it comes to having the dialogue indicator reflect what is actually going to be said. The result is that there might be choices, but the important ones are arbitrary, leading to the feeling that the game is far too linear and the whole role-playing aspect is just on the surface level. Looking back at all of it, if you're a huge fan of vampire stories, then you might like this from the get-go, but most people won't be so permissive to get over the huge flaws present in the narrative. Which, finally, brings this overly long video to its conclusion. Vampyr by DONTNOD Entertainment is one of the most disappointing games I've played recently. It has very high ambitions but doesn't manage to deliver one well-realized aspect that would turn it into a cult classic, if not a straight classic. It doesn't even do anything so bad that it is memorable. It is just a mixture of mediocrity and missed opportunities. I know this is a bit of anecdata, but I talked to my circle of friends and acquaintances about this game and I found 6 other people who have played it. Not a single one finished it, citing a combination of boredom and disappointment. I didn't want to finish it. I noted that 25 hours in, and I would have given up if it weren't for the fact that I wanted to make a video on it. Obviously that doesn't mean anything conclusive, but it hints to the fact that the game just doesn't manage to have a strong cohesive point to keep up the interest. And you know what the irony of ironies is in Vampyr using the flavorless template set by KOTOR so it can easily slot in the aesthetics of Star Wars? This game is probably one of the best attempts at systemizing the morality presented in Star Wars. Nowadays the franchise says that the dark side and light side are 2 distinct things from which Force users get different powers and their personality determines which ones they can access, but that is not how it was in the beginning. The Force was spirituality, the dark and light sides were philosophies. Vampyr's premise actually showcases this very well. Both the good and the bad can reach level 10. It's just that the bad can do it faster at the cost of hurting others. Realizing things like this makes the missed potential taste all the more bitter. Wikipedia tells me that Vampyr was a financial success, which actually makes me happy because I think DONTNOD deserves to keep going. The potential to do something great in the role-playing game genre is there. And maybe that potential will fully develop in a future project, but at the same time, that future does not bode well for Vampyr's attempts at innovation. I think chances are very slim that I will use this game as a point of reference for story, gameplay or production value in any future video, except maybe as a point of reference for disappointment. Vampyr may have kept the lights on for DONTNOD, but it will not be able to keep the long shadow of time at bay. The best it can hope for 10 years from now is to be a footnote in RPG history, which is more than many games, but also less than so many others.